Assuming a lot of you were listening to Lucy's talk previously, so we heard a lot of good information about the issues you run into with consortiums, or just really a lot of the things you'll see in enterprise when you're trying to build systems, especially with a lot of stakeholders involved. This is going to be kind of a talk that focuses on my own experience. I think probably at a lower level, thinking about what kind of challenges you'll see in the entire really lifecycle development process for enterprise. And really, I think how it differs if you're coming at it from a crypto slash decentralized app perspective. A lot of things can definitely change if you're coming from that world into enterprise. So let me go ahead and get started with, let me pull up the screen. There we go. So I'll start with my story real quick to kind of give you some background on where I'm coming from. I started out very much in the crypto Bitcoin space. I was a Bitcoin miner in high school, found some school computers that no one was using, decided to run some software, see how it worked, and then very quickly fell down the rabbit hole of realizing that the technology had a lot of potential, not just in finance, but in a lot of other things. So eventually started to do more freelance consulting by showing up to Bitcoin meetups locally. This was around like 2012, 2013. Um, and then from there, things kind of just took off. And I was kind of very early on with a few people working in the space, mainly as a high schooler trying to make money. But the skills were suddenly in demand, and so I've been really consulting in this space ever since. So very quickly, it turned into more of a full-time job. I started a cryptocurrency consulting firm. Started really focusing on mining and trading, and then with the launch of Ethereum, in 2015, I started to learn more about the application of blockchain beyond just digital currencies and started to see that this was going to be an interesting path. At that same time, I was studying computer science, doing a little bit more research into that space. And then very quickly, I learned that those two worlds met in a very interesting way, especially for Ethereum. So eventually, I started to focus more on smart contracts and software architecture, and then I very quickly kind of morphed into what is now a blockchain solutions architect. Kind of taking what I had learned from the IT crypto perspective and then combining it with what I had learned as a programmer, both through my education at UT Dallas as well as my first industry experience was with working on blockchain projects, which was quite a ride. ICOs and others like that were really where I got my first industry experience, and it was definitely a weird, wild place to learn it. But very much since then, I think I've actually been focusing more on enterprise projects. I've consulted on corporate projects at Thomson Reuters, Toyota, Verizon, and then I also lecture on blockchain at UT Dallas with some context setting for enterprises because a lot of our students are hired by local corporate companies in the area. So my perspective has definitely changed. It's kind of gone from very much the let's say free range crypto projects to the enterprise projects for blockchain. And so I've kind of understand the perspective of both sides. And so I found that there's a lot of challenges you face when you're bringing blockchain into an enterprise project or into an enterprise setting. So this talk is really going to focus on how you get blockchain use cases to succeed in an enterprise environment. So right now we see the reason for building an enterprise. It's the fact that they're the ones putting down the money. We're seeing that almost $21 billion is going to be invested over the next 5 years. And so naturally there are people that want to take advantage of that and not only take advantage of the financial opportunities, but the fact that if enterprise is going to put down the money and invest in it, then maybe this is where we see some of the first mass adoption for blockchain. And that's going to be good, regardless of what you feel about enterprise or how you like it. Any good mass adoption of blockchain is typically a good thing. And if enterprises are going to help us lead the way in that, then by all means, we should encourage it. So I think that's ultimately where a lot of people in the space are looking to enterprise for. We know Consensus and Truffle and others, they're starting to get more adoption from enterprise, and I can definitely see that myself. And so I think for a lot of you, there might be some opportunities you see in enterprise as well, but maybe you're not as familiar with them. So there's a lot of opportunities for them, but they require a very different approach if you're used to the typical Ethereum decentralized app in a lot of ways. So in my experience, they have unique challenges when adopting blockchain technology. And these challenges, I think, are far more crucial to address in the early stages in order for you to be successful, especially because the context and the education around what blockchain is doing in enterprise, it's very difficult to reverse course or to change course when you've started on a particular path. Enterprises like to say they've embraced agile, but in many ways, there's still a waterfall mentality behind what they're trying to accomplish. And you have to be careful not to fall down the wrong path and not be able to reverse due to the pressures you're under. So these are some of the companies I've worked with: Thomson Reuters, Verizon, Toyota. Each of them were addressing a different industry. Thomson Reuters was addressing accounting and e-commerce. Verizon was addressing telecommunications and coordination with other telecom companies. And Toyota was looking at it from a supply chain and logistics perspective. All very different use cases, all using different technologies. Some of them used Ethereum, some of them used Hyperledger Fabric, but almost all of them saw these challenges, and in many ways, they were the same challenge. So even though the technology and the use cases were different, many of the challenges that I saw were the same. So this talk is ultimately going to be for blockchain developers that want to build for enterprise, as well as enterprise developers and managers that might be new to blockchain, just to help to kind of bridge the gap between the two, as well as just for anyone that's interested in what the enterprise development process with blockchain will typically look like. So by the end of this talk, I hope you'll come away with a far greater understanding of those challenges and how you can potentially address them. And I will add with a stipulation that a lot of these are typical challenges you'll see with enterprise project, but there I think is a certain emphasis on particular issues that blockchain specifically is, I think is unique to blockchain. We have to address certain challenges that you just don't see with other projects, or they're just not as big of a deal. So ultimately, I'm going to frame this entire conversation around the path from discovery to production, because I think that's the path that many projects go down, and eventually on one of those tracks, they falter. I think we've heard statistics that it's very difficult to get to production. I think it was 95% of blockchain projects in enterprise don't make it all the way to production, and there are good reasons for some of them, but I think others, maybe they were projects or ideas that in discovery made sense, but there was something along the way that went wrong that could have been avoided. And I think it's mainly because these challenges are so new that people haven't yet learned to address them on a whole scale. So let me give an analogy. Let's start out with something simple that I think you'll all understand. You should all know how the blockchain works right now, and to give you a quick visual reminder to show how this works is we have a single block with a list of transactions within them. There's a timestamp. There's a nonce for the miners. There's a Merkle root that links to a list of transactions, and the entire point of this is to have an immutable order of transaction events. That's ultimately the big benefit that blockchain can provide in many contexts, both for money and others. That is then going to be linked to a previous block that has the same makeup, and then it links to the past block, and the past block going from block 101 to block 0 being the genesis block. And so that's ultimately how this entire chain is formed. And then same thing going forward, it will continue to be added on top. And so if we change the transactions, then the Merkle root is going to be invalidated. Bam, that's a problem. And this is where hashing comes in. So if the hash is invalidated through the Merkle root, then we know that the transactions have been modified. And then through that, it will also invalidate all blocks after it. So this is where we get this kind of hash link between blocks as well as between the transactions. And that's ultimately the way that we ensure that data is protected and ordered correctly. And so the analogy I'll put in with this is ultimately what I think is necessary for a project to be successful, and that is to establish a correct order of development. So you need to have a roadmap, and it needs to, I think there are certain challenges you need to address in the right order. Otherwise, just like a hash link will fail, your project may very well fail. It might not be as direct or as, let's say absolute, but in many cases, if these things aren't addressed in the correct way, they don't typically work out well in the long term, because you need to know how to get from discovery to production and know where the challenges need to be addressed. You don't want to address certain challenges too early. You don't want to address other challenges way too late to actually prepare for them. So ultimately, it is a case of knowing what you need to prioritize first, and to do that within a context of knowing that even though you might want to take an agile approach, which is usually my preference, you'll have to do it in an enterprise context that typically wants to see more structure around just exploration. So the first one is going to be discovery. You want to know what you're trying to do, what is the value add. You need to educate people on what you're trying to achieve. You need to engage your stakeholders, and you need to analyze the data that is going to be necessary to address this use case. You're going to have prototyping and the proof of concept phase, where you start to get into the technical details of how are we going to build this, what are we going to use. What's the degree of trust we need? I'll tell you about that soon. That's an important one. How are the smart contracts going to be structured? Or more specifically, how is business logic on chain going to work? And then how is that data going to be designed? How is it going to integrate with existing systems? How is it going to, how are the scheme is going to be structured? How is it going to change over time? Very crucial things to understand early on. And then as you go through those and solve those issues, and then again, I would say at each stage there's a very critical review of whether we're on the right track and we can continue, which is just typically how enterprises will operate. You'll have the MVP trial run, which is where you get into, I think, the more nitty gritty. Um, you know, Rubber meets the road. The tech might work, but will it work in the context of a live scenario? So you typically, this is where you're going to face off with security and legal in whatever enterprise you're talking with. So that's going to be the security privileges. That's going to be the legal requirements. You're going to have DevOps and figuring out how those operations work, user testing, and then validating that this is actually providing the value we thought it would in the discovery phase. And then last but not least, production. And that's system upgrades, governance, scaling, feature planning. So these are all things that can take a long time to achieve, and they will typically involve engagement with multiple stakeholders. You're going to have a lot more people you're talking to in these scenarios, and especially, and it kind of depends. These can apply to either you working with an enterprise as an external company, or it can be you working more internally as part of an enterprise. These are both challenges that you'll face, but ultimately these same things will occur and typically happen in the same order. So these are all like, this is a typical pathway you would see for any project, but I think blockchain adds another layer of complexity to this because there's a large gap that you'll see between the language and ideas that developers are thinking of or that they have and what enterprise users are thinking the technology is trying to achieve. And this is ultimately, I think, where you see a lot of issues come up, and that's one of the reasons I think they should be addressed as early as possible. Lucy kind of alluded to this, the fact that the developers will see the initiative. If let's assume a lot of us here are developers or technologists, we see the potential of this technology. We know long term what the value is going to be, but trying to understand that as an enterprise user, especially an enterprise user that's thinking maybe more of on a quarterly basis of like, what value do we provide to our bosses next quarter? What do we say we achieve? That's going to be more difficult if the technology is not well understood, especially because his boss will not understand the technology initially, and his boss won't, and all the way up to the executive level where they might think they want blockchain, but when it comes down to what it costs and how it needs to be built, that becomes a little bit more nebulous. And so you really have to consider that going in and address it accordingly. So let me break this down a little bit further and help you understand what each of these boxes really means for me. And I'll give you some stories about what I faced, because I faced some projects that failed and some projects that succeeded, and it usually depended on how they addressed one or several of these metrics. So the discovery phase is probably the most important for knowing that you're on the right track and that you're defining what the blockchain is going to do. And that's typically where you need to get that right initially, and you need to make sure everyone understands it well. So really just addressing it from a high level and making sure that this is even something worth pursuing. This is typically the test of, is this a blockchain project that's going to provide value, or is this a project that wants to be a blockchain? So determining that early on is going to make your life a lot easier. So first of all, the big one is going to be value add. What is, find a metric and KPI and stick to it. And that can be sometimes tough, especially if there are a lot of different metrics in which you could be applying it, or maybe it's something that is still being explored. But I think before you pass discovery, figure out that metric and know it's something that you can come back to throughout the rest of these phases to know you're still hitting it. And so it can be as simple as, we're going to cut processing time from 1 week to 2 hours. And therefore, money is moving faster, the velocity is moving faster, and therefore we have, we're delivering more value. It could also be reducing man hours with some automation. We're automating some trusted procedure, and therefore, the 10 hours that we might have had to spend filing or resolving a claim is now 2 minutes, and therefore those are man hours that you can estimate and provide value on and say, we're saving $2 million a year because we're no longer spending all this time processing claims or something like that, and we're processing them faster. So these are all things where you need to really define that and stick to it. And that's ultimately, when you're talking to your enterprise stakeholders, that's what you need to hit every time. This is what we're going to do, and this is how it's going to provide value. you need to engage stakeholders and you need to find them. You need to know who they are, and you have to have that like list down pretty early on, I'll say. And this can be like herding cats because there's so many different departments that can be involved. For example, if you're talking about a supply chain department, this was something we had at Toyota. There's many different departments that handle different parts of the supply chain process. And if you're trying to build an end-to-end traceability solution, for example, all of those departments want to be a part of it. And suddenly it's a question of not only, like, you could even be in a situation where they all want it, but they don't want the other department to have more control over what's going on. And so you need to navigate that early on. And ultimately, I think you just need to focus on which stakeholder has the best understanding of what we're trying to do. It might come down to even the interpersonal relationship you have with the heads of those departments, who will back you up in a meeting, who sees the long-term value, and focus on them first, and then work your way down. But make sure you still engage with everyone, so that you're never going to be surprised down the road when there's someone else that wants to be involved or should have been involved. So really figuring out stakeholders, you need to discover your stakeholders in some cases, and keep them in mind throughout the rest of the process. And again, it's harder than adapt, because adapt typically has stakeholders in the developers and then the community, and typically just the user profiles. But stakeholders can be far more nebulous in the enterprise context, and they involve almost more politics than you might like. But they are necessary to engage and understand in order to be successful. Education is another crucial part. Once you've identified these stakeholders, you need to, in many cases, educate them on what blockchain is, especially if they're new to it. Or maybe, God forbid, they've learned it from another consulting firm and they've done a lot of damage you have to undo. I've had that problem before, in terms of people saying, "Oh yes, let's throw this block. Let's throw." You wouldn't put a movie on a blockchain, for example. I've had to have that discussion, believe it or not. And this is ultimately going to be, I think, an ongoing process, and it's going to test your patience. But it's important, because if they have a different view of what blockchain is doing, that might seem benign today because you're like, I'll just tell them the high level stuff and we'll work through it. But down the road, that can run into issues when they start thinking that the blockchain is not providing the value they expected, or it's going to, it's not going to solve all the problems they were expecting. For example, it's not going to solve data integrity in other ways of, like, just the data being clean before it goes in the blockchain, for example. So it's important to explain it, and it's also important to, I would say, give them only the details that matter to them, but make sure they understand those details very well. If you're talking to the accounting department, give them the Truffle ledger entry explanation, understand how that works, in terms of, this is just another way to handle accounting. If you're talking to the IT department, maybe get more technical, but explain it from the context of how this is really a distributed transaction processing system. So try to give context to each department you talk to, or each stakeholder, and help them understand what's going on. And I would say, don't give them too much detail, but give them the details that will matter to them and their respective organization. And then last of all, data analysis. Know who your data is going to come from. There might be some data that you need, typically in an enterprise use case, that will come from external systems, or I should say, other legacy data systems within the organization. So first of all, you have to identify where those are coming from. Identify who is managing that data, who's the data king, you should say, because I would say, if you have to talk to DB admins, know that can turn into almost like going to different feudal castles and negotiating with different feudal lords over how you're going to access their data, and how you're not going to break their system because of this new fancy blockchain, or try to replace them either. That can be another conception that they'll have. So you'll have to handle that, and you'll also have to consider where that data is in the terms of what's legacy and what's new. So, I mean, I've worked on projects and they were awful, but we've had to pull data onto a blockchain from IBM mainframes before, regularly, because the problem in legacy, and I'm sure some of you are aware, that if they built an IBM mainframe to host data in the 70s and they still have other external systems dependent on that, even though they probably should have just bit the bullet and done a large migration, they probably haven't, because they were able to keep it running because one COBOL developer stuck around. So that will come up, and the best thing you can do is plan for it ahead, and know about it as soon as possible, so that you know how to approach it. So once you've gotten past discovery, you validated the concept is good, the stakeholders are engaged and they're willing to invest time and money into it. Now you have to figure out if the technology is going to be viable and how you are going to design the system. And then Tass had a question on what interest do you see in public versus private blockchains for enterprise? And do you see interest in public chains increasing as layer 2 matures? I actually have a couple of slides near the end that will address that very well. But my short answer is that I see that private started out to be the really strong one, and then it slowly moved to more of an interest in how public could be more engaged, but it's ultimately how they're trying to address their use case. One thing that I think like is a factor you have to consider, and this is one that I don't see as much, at least not explicitly mentioned in a lot of projects, is what is the degree of trust? And that's important because ultimately the system is going to likely be more centralized in an enterprise context than a decentralized one. But you still do need typically some decentralization, some place, or it doesn't make sense for you to be using blockchain. So there's something you're decentralizing or disintermediating. But maybe it's not everything, or maybe it's not like a Web3 stack where we're trying to host everything in a decentralized, open, accessible way. Enterprises don't necessarily need or want that, but there might still be parts of that system that they do want to have disintermediated. So you don't want to go overboard with decentralization, but you also can't completely, ignore it, because you do need to provide that value of having a distributed, robust system that's, trustworthy in some way. It's typically figuring out who are we trying to disintermediate, or who are we trying to encourage trust between. For example, a permission blockchain, if you're not going to engage outside parties from the company, it might not make as much sense. But maybe you're trying to build something that is used for compliance purposes. There's a lot of different ways you could do it. But all of that, when you figure out what that degree of trust is, what are we trying to disintermediate, that's where you get into tech selection. And so then you say, okay, what is going to give us that degree of trust while also giving us the best performance and I guess, an enterprise-friendly tool set as possible. So you're going to have to pick a blockchain framework and a tool set that ultimately favors your enterprise. And this is going to be an important one because there's typically, like, I would say the best tooling and some of the best systems out there for blockchain that, like, I would say are getting the most like real world adoption in terms of, like, things like dApps that are running. They're not typically catering to enterprise companies. And so, for example, like the fact that JavaScript is kind of the go-to API language for Ethereum, enterprises are not typically a fan of that. They'll get away with TypeScript and others, but like for actual business logic and backend systems, they really prefer Java and other things like that. And so you'll want to look for some blockchain frameworks that might be able to cater to that better, simply because, especially if you're working with an enterprise that wants to maintain it long term internally, their internal staff needs to know the language, or at least have a good head start on what's going on. And so if you're going to approach them with a technology stack that they're not familiar with, or they simply don't feel comfortable with, it's going to be harder to engage them or to get them interested. You always want to get them as interested as possible. And even if you personally might think that another tech stack is better, as long as the alternative that would be more enterprise friendly is still viable, it's still going to be, it's still going to provide what you need, even if it doesn't feel as clean. That might be the route to go, simply to make sure that you have the buy-in that you want. And again, keeping in mind with how decentralized does it have to be? Are you going to provide SQL support? That's another one you have to think of. So, like, the different things like that, you'll have to consider depending on what your enterprise favors. But probably it's going to be more legacy tech, so you're going to have to think more of how a legacy person would want to approach it. You need to think about your smart contracts, and smart contracts might not even be like Ethereum contracts. You might even have a blockchain that doesn't need necessarily smart contracts that are Turing complete, but still, whatever logic or transaction processing is going on chain, you want to limit those requirements, I would say, as much as possible to ensure scalability and flexibility. And what I mean by limit the requirements, you don't want to be very complex or very detailed on chain, especially not in the beginning. Because ultimately what I've seen is enterprise business logic can be very complex, and it can be subject to changes from many different sources, especially if it's involving multiple parties. So, for example, at Verizon, we were doing claims processing, and some of the stuff we were doing on chain was constantly being updated, or it was constantly misunderstood. Like the gap between the business user that was actually determining what that business logic should have been and the developer writing it into a smart contract was very large. And ultimately, we just ran into more issues just trying to get it out there and maintain it and make sure that it was appropriate for what we were trying to achieve. And I think the better solution that we came up with in other projects was to make that as generic as possible, to say, hey, we'll build smart contracts that don't actually have to be defined explicitly on chain, but we'll build an engine or some sort of a workflow that a business user can define from, a front end or from something that they can understand, that then gets translated to a smart contract they could generate dynamically. That was one approach that we found was far more successful, because we didn't require developers to understand business logic. They just had to really understand more of the meta process for defining that logic, and then leave it to the business people to actually implement that themselves. And so that was one example. And I think that sounds obvious maybe to some developers in this chat, but to someone in enterprise, hard coding things might be more of a common practice than you would think. And so this is definitely something you want to address early on, and make sure that your smart contracts are not going to be overloaded with complexity or logic that you really should not be trying to build at that time. And then most importantly, I think data designing and modeling. And this is ultimately where you're going to have to address the issue of blockchains are not a database, and they should not be treated as such. And I've definitely had to have that conversation. You need to make sure that data is structured so that, first of all, I would say you want to keep the minimum amount of data on chain that you need. You don't want to have a lot of data dependencies, and you don't want any like on-chain schemas to be defined in a way that makes it difficult to change down the road. So you want to decouple that as much as possible, especially if you're dependent on data that you're getting from other sources. If that data changes, then you're suddenly needing to change as well. So you don't control ultimately the structure of your own data. You're just kind of left picking up after what everyone else changes. So you definitely want to be careful with that. And I would definitely recommend that you also, not only hold as much as you can off chain and use things like hash linking, and so just embedding hashes into the blockchain to keep that for data that is essentially off chain. But you would also want to look for ways to make sure that even the blockchain data can be accessed in a way that is scalable. And there's definitely solutions out there for creating essentially read replicas of nodes, or to even create ways to translate data held in a node to SQL, which I'm sure if is something that a lot of enterprises also favor. So their business analysts might not know how to read from a MongoDB database, certainly probably not a Level DB database, or to use an API, but they might very well know SQL. So that's another thing you have to consider. Yeah, and thankfully most enterprises never want data on chain. Luce, I'm glad you brought. Some do, but believe it or not, I've met some that don't understand that they don't. And granted, these are permission blockchains, so that's part of it. But it was still definitely, it was surprising that we had to have that conversation. But I have had to have it before, believe it or not, at high levels too. I was surprised. So ultimately, data designing and modeling, once you get that figured out, once you've figured out that this is feasible from a technical perspective, now it's where you get into MVP trial deployment. And that's really to make sure that this is actually going to work in a live scenario. So the first big thing that you might face at this point, and I would say you probably engaged security and legal beforehand, I would hope so, but this is where you're ultimately going to have to come to firm agreements with them on how the system is going to be handled, because that's when, if you're talking about a live system that's going to handle live data, even if it's on a small scale, that's when you're going to have a lot of engagement with both the security teams and legal teams to make sure that it's compliant with their standards. And even the most benign systems, like let's say you're just hashing data and putting that on chain, even that can come under a lot of legal scrutiny and security audits. For example, if you're hashing data that is confidential by some agreement, there are some lawyers that will say, and these are like conversations I've had, some will say, hey, if the data is hashed, and then let's say we get hacked, and then someone hacks that data, someone steals the data through a traditional database, and then if they can use that blockchain to validate that the data they've hacked is valid, that could be a place where they actually have to face liability, because now the hacker can essentially use a blockchain, assuming this is a publicly accessible blockchain, to validate that what they've stolen is correct. So you have to control for those scenarios too. And there are ways to control for those scenarios that are just common security techniques you can add into your hashing, but it's something that you need to know. The question will come up and you need to know how to answer it confidently, or they're going to just dig into the nuts and bolts even more to make sure that they feel comfortable with it. And that can be a very long process. So it's definitely about, and that's where, keeping your system, especially the way you've modeled your data, as simple as possible and as off chain as possible in terms of the the confidential data, that's gonna save you a lot of time and hassle. Another thing is DevOps. DevOps can be very complicated with blockchain systems in a cloud governance model because it can take weeks sometimes or even months to get what you need provisioned if they have a very, let's say, archaic IT and governance process where you need to get approval from the right people. You need to fill out the right tags to spin up new services. It can just be a very long process, but you want to have a full deployment pipeline as early as possible, or you're not going to be testing on a real live scenario even before you deploy it to actual users. You want to get that pipeline set up as soon as possible. So make sure DevOps is one of your first priorities because it might take a while to get the full thing done, but the sooner you get that done, the sooner you can treat that pipeline as the real deal. And know how to deploy things rapidly. And that does save a lot of time in your MVP as well as in the future. So, and don't be afraid to potentially find other avenues. I've had situations where we built the MVP entirely offsite or entirely off of the, away from the typical infrastructure. And we just were able to we managed to get approval from the right people to do that because getting approval from the people that could let us do something offsite was faster than getting approval from someone to provision the right thing on site. If you know the right person in enterprise, they can help you with that, and just making sure that you're still being compliant and you're still managing things properly. But that, at least especially in the MVP phase, that might be necessary because you're trying to show value and you're trying to show that the system works as soon as possible. And you don't want the impression that this blockchain system is taking too much time to build, especially if that's really more on the DevOps or the cloud governance process in enterprise rather than the system actually not being difficult. It might be easy to build that system, but the processes around getting your resources you need might for some reason be very difficult to process. It's just, avoid the bureaucracy and focus on providing the technical feasibility or to prove it in a live scenario. Another thing is, of course, user testing. You want to be engaged with your users actually within discovery, but this is at the point where you really want to be making them a critical part of the development process. And that means you want to be engaging them as early as showing them the mockups and getting feedback on that. And then as you build it and as you provide features, making sure that they are the ones signing off on saying, yes, this provides what I want and it makes sense for me. And the real important thing I think in enterprise that happens a lot is that you don't want to be getting the feedback just from their managers or from the people that work in the departments, but don't do the actual day-to-day stuff that we're actually trying to solve for. That's something I see a lot. You don't, because ultimately there's can be a lot of, there's layers of miscommunication that occur, or they simply have assumptions about the way things are done that are incorrect. You want to be working with at least some of the people that are day-to-day doing either claims processing or supply chain management or handling purchases and payments. You want to be the people that you want to work with the people that are in the nitty-gritty, that know how the things are getting done. And you want to make sure that what you're doing is actually going to address the needs that they have, not just what their manager might think they have. And that's a hard lesson that's been learned in a few projects I've been on. And then last but not least, make sure that you at the end are figuring out what the return on investment is going to be. And this kind of gets back to the value add that we talked about earlier. But ultimately, if you can address that early on, and basically within this MVP, you can show that you saved real money. It doesn't matter if it's, as long as it's something that shows, hey, on a small scale, on this one shipment, for example, we showed the ability to trace this part from end to end. We saved this much time that people didn't have to spend. And as well as the fact that, in scenarios where there's a dispute, we can resolve it this quickly, figure all those metrics out, make sure your MVP is going to actually show that and prove it. And then you can really sell them on, hey, this is a project that has shown it can work in a live scenario. We're ready to take this potentially to the next level. Because this is ultimately where that's, the higher up approvals, they're going to want to see the numbers. They're going to want to know what the actual value add is. And that's ultimately all the way to the CEO. You're going to want to see those metrics. That's right. So yeah, enterprises, they love cost savings. There's two metrics. There's either you're going to provide better profits or you're going to provide cutting costs. And just make sure that you're addressing one or both of those in a way that people are going to get excited about. The people that have to show a big chart at the end of the quarter, if they feel like that's going to make their chart look better, then they're going to focus on giving you what you need to succeed. So once you've gotten to this, now we're at the big boy table, the final boss. And this is where I think I see a lot of projects. They either don't make it to this stage, or this is the stage that they ultimately falter at. And that is going into production. This is where I've seen, I think it was 95% of blockchain projects don't make it this far. because there's still just a lot it takes. In some cases, that was appropriate. I think some of these projects shouldn't. Some projects you learn early on, they just don't make sense by the production, or maybe you're too early. The technology needs to develop. But if you've gotten to this point, you should feel confident that what you've done is ready for production today with the current technology and the design choices you've made. And then you ultimately, hopefully, you've solved all of the real technical challenges in terms of design, as well as knowing that it will provide business value. This is ultimately making sure that it will take that and scale it up to the point where this is a real production system. And this is, I think there's definition changes. Some people will say I'm in production when they're really just doing a live trial or MVP. And I would not consider those the same thing. Production is, this thing is going out to large numbers of users. You're going to see the whole system with lots of activity every day. It cannot be shut down. That's the crucial part. You can't shut it down once you go into production. You can't shut it down for any extended period of time, because ultimately you're making this a critical part of the infrastructure. It's not a test. It's you're ultimately trying to start making this the go-to system for whatever process that you're trying to automate or embed trust into. So a lot of pressure. The one thing that you definitely need to be careful about going in is how you're going to do your system upgrades. And this can be difficult because blockchain technology is rapidly changing. So you're going to see a lot of upgrades or updates needed, especially if you want to keep up and be competitive. So be prepared to make those upgrades to your system, but ensure you're not going to cause massive you're not going to cause disruptions, and you're not going to overrun your tech teams, because I've seen some migrations that it just drives people nuts, just because blockchains are more difficult. You've got either, if you've got a distributed system where multiple people or stakeholders are running nodes, you have to coordinate with them. You can see how the Ethereum cat herders do when it comes to trying to coordinate node upgrades with the public protocol, which is quite difficult. It's a similar process with enterprise, except I would say there's also just the day-to-day. You still have to be providing value. Sometimes you still have to be throwing features out there. So just dealing with an upgrade, if it takes weeks to do, you're going to have a lot of questions on why this is taking so long. And hey, is this really going to work long term if you're spending all your time just trying to upgrade it instead of improve it? So this is one area where you want to plan ahead to make sure that those can be going as smoothly as possible, that you're addressing them early so that you're not trying to address them after they become critical, especially for security issues. So this is ultimately a big area where I think I've seen systems that struggled with this to the point where it practically killed the project because they didn't know how to upgrade. Their best solution was literally to nuke the blockchain they had and start over. And that basically killed any, if you're nuking your blockchain in terms of the data is basically just being replaced by a new blockchain, and you're just doing a massive data migration. At that point, it's what's the point? And so that was, these are the areas where you have to be really careful. And that was a Hyperledger Fabric project, but I'm sure the same thing could happen to Ethereum if you're not planning for that appropriately, especially if you're not planning for it to be a regular occurrence that it very well could be. And this doesn't apply to just the nodes. It could apply to the smart contracts. It can apply to the other critical systems that are a part of or critical components that are part of your system. So you have to plan for all these. It can also be, changes to other systems that you're integrated with. So other data silos you're pulling from, they might be doing data migrations. These are all things you just have to be prepared for and know you can handle without taking away from everything else you have to do. So another thing that you have to handle is governance, and this can vary depending on what your project is. Lucy talked a lot about this, but if your blockchain is managed with other parties, you're going to have to form a governance process very early on, and you're going to have to keep everyone engaged. This can be, if this is an internal system, this is a blockchain being trialed within your company, it will be easier, but you still have to consider the fact that some of these departments are practically like different countries in that company. In the way that they operate. So you do still have to consider the fact that they're going to have their own agenda. They're going to have their own incentives. They're going to have differing levels of engagement or different ways that they want to use the system. And so you have to always take that into account when you're pulling them in. And when it comes to external parties, whether those are customers or they are other enterprise companies that want to participate, and this is like a consortium, that's especially important, to the point where I think governance actually overtakes the technical challenges, in terms of the fact that if you can't get governance right, the tech can be as good as it possibly could, and it still could fail. And if other parties are pulling back, after this thing is started, it could mean death for the system long term. So you want to start small when you're doing this. Typically, if you're going to launch that system, start with a core group of stakeholders and parties that you can trust to, basically stick with you in the early days, and then add to it as time goes on. So you want to be very careful about how you do governance, and you also want to make sure that you're planning for it in the way that you've designed the system as well. That the upgrades can be done collaboratively, that changes to the smart contracts can be done collaboratively, that all these things are ultimately thought of within the system itself as well. Scaling, I'm not going to say too much on scaling other than it's really important, and it's very difficult with blockchain systems. So you definitely want to be realistic with your expectations early on. So if you're going to say, yes, we can process 10,000 transactions a second, make sure that you actually know how that's going to be done before you commit to it, or even say it's a possibility within the near future, even within a year or two. Because we've all heard the Ethereum 2.0 is going to come out soon line, and we know that it will probably, you can add another 6 months onto that and maybe it'll be more accurate. Luckily, we're almost there, it looks like, but that kind of timeline is not going to go over nearly as well within an enterprise context. So I'm happy the Ethereum folks are taking their time to do it right, but within enterprise, they're going to want the results to be seen within the time that you've committed, especially if there's a commitment on paper. So always keep low expectations for scale while still making sure you're delivering value, and then just scale over time as you can find those solutions. Oh, and look for off-chain alternatives. So if you can do more things off-chain in a way that improves your scalability, definitely do it. Whether it's doing off-chain processing, off-chain data storage, as many interactions and like transaction events off-chain that you can handle as possible, that's going to be more ideal. Just because, again, it's going to be less complex and it's going to be easier to scale. And I always feel like a light approach on a blockchain is the best way to go. It's a transaction processing engine. You can almost think of it like a database. It's kind of like people that like to program database transactions with SQL. So you can, for example, you can program a transaction to take place within the database as an atomic event, or you can program it on the backend server. And ultimately, that's the same approach you should take with the blockchain. So if you think, this is something I can either write as a blockchain atomic transaction event, or I can write it as backend server code. Backend server code is always going to be better when it's more complex, when it takes more time, or when it's going to be subject to numerous changes. Whereas with the blockchain, just make sure that those changes are going to be far and few between, and that when you have to do transaction processing, it's going to be for stuff that has to be trusted and is fairly simple or simple to break up. And then last but not least, feature planning. Make sure you know how you're going to deliver your features, and plan those accordingly with feedback from the stakeholders and users. So once you've got that thing out there, know how to add to it. This kind of gets into system upgrades, but it's also about making sure that you keep up the momentum. If you've gotten to production stage, you've been successful with that release. People are going to be excited, but if you've done it properly, you're probably delivering something that is pretty simple to start with. But once you figured out how to get simple running right, now you want to start to add on to that with things that might be adding additional value. So for example, at Toyota, we built a workflow management system that was able to move, it was essentially like a virtual Kanban board, and you can move non-fungible asset tokens from one point to another, to another, and to another. So it was like a blockchain version of Trello, but you could track asset management that way. And it was simple, but it delivered one thing well with a good user experience. And that was ultimately what we wanted to achieve. And then from there, and only then, did we start to add on additional features such as, okay, now let's look at what analytics look like. Now that we have some data being generated, let's look at what, putting these tags on vehicles running off the lot might look like. There's a lot of other use cases that our stakeholders wanted, but I always had to tell them at the end of the day, let's focus on getting this part done first, and then we can talk about all the other things you want to do. Because ultimately, none of those really make sense or can work if we can't nail this down first. And that's going to be sometimes difficult. Sometimes the people you're talking to, there can be enterprise folks that actually get really excited about blockchain to the point where you're going to actually have to be the one that calms them down and reminds them that you have to address some of the more pressing challenges today and talk about those others later. And you don't want to talk about those others too much, or there's going to be an expectation from the other stakeholders or the higher ups that are hearing about this, that those are actually coming soon when you might not be able to deliver on them quite yet. But make sure that they're planned for, and make sure you do have a plan to address them eventually. So with that being said, we've got a little bit of time left. So I've kind of gone over the kind of overview of what we would be looking at for that process. So what are the tools and ultimately what are the ways we can address those challenges to make our lives easier? And I'm sure you've heard of some of these. So first of all, there's DevOps tooling. So if you can simplify the development pipeline and you can make things easy to develop, test, and push out, then you're going to have a lot of easier engagement with the development teams that you are working with. And so Truffle Suite is obviously one of the main staples of this in the Ethereum community, but they have been doing some good some good work to also integrate with enterprise platforms, including Quorum, to better remove complexity from the process. Ultimately, you're going to see a lot of enterprise developers that are used to mature development pipelines. Sometimes they've never even set up a pipeline themselves because there's always some team that does it for them. So if you can set that up early on in your project, you're going to have a lot more engagement with them because you're able to abstract away a lot of the kind of blockchainy details of messing with the blockchain that ultimately would otherwise confuse them and just make it more difficult to get things done. So getting a good DevOps pipeline and setup going is going to be really, really important for having a successful project, especially within enterprise. Another thing is to know that there are enterprise frameworks out there. So permission frameworks are obviously very popular with enterprise. They're still looking at public, I would say, in some cases, but in cases where they're trying to build something with a limited party membership, it's good to always use the frameworks out there. So I've worked with Hyperledger Fabric and others. I'm not a fan of it, if I'm being honest. Funny enough, I've actually found that Quorum can be a lot easier to manage in enterprise just because there's less complex components involved. Because Hyperledger Fabric actually took an approach of having a lot of different components running in Kubernetes clusters, and that's cool, but I've actually found that most enterprises are not super sophisticated in the way they can handle DevOps or Kubernetes, at least not within the context of doing it quickly. So starting with something like Quorum can actually be a little bit easier, and it gives you privacy features and it gives you ways to enhance performance. So for example, Raft consensus is actually one of the things I've found really nice with Quorum when we were working on it with Toyota. It doesn't use Byzantine fault tolerance, but it does use a consensus algorithm that will ultimately just kind of have a leader-follower approach. But because of that, it is very fast. Like you can have sub-second transaction times, and that makes all the difference in the world when you are trying to give a good user experience in an enterprise setting. And it also, gives them a lot more, makes them feel a lot more comfortable with the ability to scale. And so if your system doesn't really require Byzantine fault tolerance, if you have an assumption that everyone running a node is going to act honestly, that can definitely be worth it. Oh, and Truffle Teams, yes, Truffle Teams is another good one. And I have not used Truffle Teams, but I've heard a lot of good things about it. And it would definitely be crucial for coordinating between teams and the way they're managing their pipelines. And then also, these frameworks will also support a lot of Java and other languages that are going to be more prevalent in enterprise ecosystems. So you'll have an easier time getting people involved, and they'll understand it better. You're speaking their language. And then last but not least is blockchain as a service, which is ultimately kind of the ultimate end of having a lot of things done for you. Both Block Apps and Kaleido are services I've used. They're both very good, very mature platforms. They come with a lot of stuff embedded in it. Block Apps was actually one of the original developers of Quorum, so they kind of took what they built there and really extended it into something that is very fast, performant, and then has a lot of features. So they have ETL tools for pulling in external data. They have SQL query tools for people to query blockchain data. They have governance tools. They have single sign-on tools for account keys. That's a lot of the stuff they provide. Kaleido has a lot of similar things as well. They also make it very easy to handle governance, where you can invite other companies in and they can run nodes that are connected to their own cloud accounts. But ultimately, the blockchain as a service will manage most of that for them. And that it really cuts down on development time and hosting headaches that could otherwise take months of time. The serious downside is, of course, that you're trusting one provider, and so there is a level of centralization there. But ultimately, I think in early stages of development, when you're trying to show viability, I think it's ultimately what enterprises need at that time, because it means that you can show value quickly, and you can always migrate to self-hosting later. Without changing the user experience. As long as you're still running Ethereum nodes, it doesn't really matter if they're running on your service or in a BAS service. You can always do that migration later if you're planning for it. There are some key features you obviously might lose if you migrate it away, so you have to be careful about that. And so The last big thing out there that I think is going to be valuable is hybrid blockchain solutions. And this is kind of a new concept that I think people are still trying to define. But for me, these are ultimately solutions that are going to try to combine the transparent, decentralized trust of a public network with the scalability and privacy of a permission chain, or sometimes not even a permission chain, but just some existing enterprise legacy system that wants to use the public chain for some sort of interoperability with others. And so this is kind of an example put together by H3 Labs. This is not my own work, by the way, but I've got a link for them at the end. But ultimately, this is where you can have a private DLT network that is ultimately working through some sort of centralized system. You have a high transaction rate. The private data is kept clean, and then you can obviously audit those transactions internally. And then you can anchor it to a public blockchain. And that gives you the ability not just to essentially kind of link to the outside and basically prove that your data is not being tampered with. So, if you publish a hash of your data to a public chain every day, you couldn't go back on that, even if all of the private nodes agreed. But you also get the ability to potentially move assets or pieces of data between those networks. That actually gives you almost like an intranet versus internet approach. So I think there's a lot of promise with this sort of system. So they're very new. But you can, essentially the main thing is to anchor a permission chain into a public one. And I think Kaleido actually provides a feature built in that lets you do this, where you can essentially say, I want to anchor my private Ethereum network into the public Ethereum network to make sure that these hashes are kind of immutably tamped every 2 hours or 12 hours or something like that. And so, yeah, you can store them for greater immutability, and then you can move that data and assets between those different bridges. So I think interoperability is going to be a massive area that we're going to continue to see adoption for. I think it's going to be crucial for enterprises because they're going to want to be able to talk to others, but they're always going to want to have their own kind of, they're going to want their own ecosystem, but there's going to be things that need to go in between them. And so interoperability, I think, is going to be crucial to see these systems really scale, because enterprises want to have control over what they feel like is theirs, but that doesn't mean they're not willing to collaborate with others. But there's going to have to be a middle ground between that. And I think ultimately that's where we'll see this start. And I think it's also good because it means that companies and enterprises can work within private permissioned ecosystems to play around with it and to understand and build value. And then they can either anchor themselves to a public network or connect to a public network, or maybe even migrate to a public network once they feel ready, using these sorts of hybrid solutions. And I should say when public networks are ready. So really quick, I'm getting close on time, but I'll go through essentially the examples that are out there. And these are some of the kind of hybrid examples that I've found that are really cool. One is Polkadot and Substrate. You might have heard of them, but they're built by Parity Technologies. Gavin Wood, who's actually the creator of the Ethereum virtual machine, was really behind this and trying to build a more scalable ecosystem. Polkadot is essentially a multi-chain framework where multiple blockchains can connect to the same system and talk to each other. And then Substrate is actually a generic blockchain framework that Polkadot is built on, but people can create either public or private blockchains with it. And so you can essentially connect what are called parachains to Polkadot, and they can each communicate with one another. So that was always a very interesting project to me. Those are really good engineers. So Substrate is not seeing as much enterprise adoption, but I think it would actually be a great use case if you found an enterprise that was interested in exactly what they're offering. Another one is Hedera Hashgraph. They're more of a local company actually here in Dallas, where I'm based. They've kind of gotten some flack in the crypto community because they're kind of the enterprise centralized controlled guys in the group, but they do have some interesting technologies and approaches. They have a scalable DLT that actually runs on a DAG rather than a blockchain, and it is actually organized by enterprise council members, including IBM, Google, and then several telecom and other providers. And so they actually have what's called a Hedera Consensus Service. You can almost think of it like a distributed Kafka cluster. And essentially, they like to say that you can essentially use this for your private blockchain, whether it's Hyperledger Fabric or Quorum or Corda, and you can use them to order your transactions in a trusted way, and then keep the rest of your data on your permission blockchain. So that's another interesting approach for a hybrid solution. And then last but not least is Baseline Protocol. They're kind of a more recent thing that's been discussed and being explored, and they're trying to use the Ethereum mainnet as a common reference point for different enterprise systems, both for permission blockchains and like ERP systems, for example. So they're another really interesting example of how we're trying to use blockchains, not really necessarily as a as a place, not as the first layer, but as a second layer, or as a layer where we can embed our current layers on our own system. So these are all almost like second layer approaches, but sometimes they have their own blockchains or ways to essentially move between them as a way to have parallel transaction processing or just an environment that enterprise controls better. Yeah, definitely a game changer. Some of them are kind of side chains, and then others are just blockchains that can talk to other blockchains. It's a very big mix of those. So it could go either way. But ultimately, in conclusion, I'll give a quick roundup before we wrap it up. We're going to see different challenges in enterprise, more coordination with company stakeholders rather than open communities. So it's a very different approach in terms of who you're trying to talk to and please. It's not going to be public information. It's going to be private meetings. It's going to be specific emails that give off the right impression of what's going on. It's going to be a very different game you're playing. It's different. It's different politics really, and different game theory that you have to consider. But ultimately, these enterprises want blockchain, and a lot of us know blockchain and can give it to them. So it's really important to know how we can bridge that gap between enterprise users, because there are missed opportunities despite the pitfalls that you might run into. So focus on your roadmap, know the challenges in that roadmap, and address them early on, because you always want to be prepared to address challenges you aren't expecting, because they will come up, by just having the rest of those settled and figure it out. You want to be able to focus on the day-to-day challenges, not the ones that you can address, but you just have to make sure you know how to address them early on, and you have to be thinking about them early on. So as we've seen, there are more tools than ever available for enterprise blockchain projects. The Truffle and Truffle teams are obviously a big one, but hybrid blockchains are also going to provide a lot of value, I think, for connecting these siloed enterprise ecosystems. I think that's a very mature way to approach things. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that develops, and ultimately to help us build more secure and scalable ecosystems. So while you might be passionate about building the technology, just always remember the value you're providing to stakeholders to ensure you get the support you need along the way. So always keep the user in mind, especially when they're enterprise, because they don't like to be missed, and they're always looking to see what the end of quarter result is going to be. So always make sure that you're kind of focusing on that. I would say it's about balancing that love for the technology with what your boss wants, or more in this case, what the enterprise customer wants. So that is it for the talk today. So thank you for listening. You can contact me you can first of all check out my website, Tarski Technologies, which is we're a product development firm that works with both enterprise and startup companies. You can check me out on LinkedIn. And then if you're interested in politics by any means, check out the Texas Blockchain Council. We are actually working on passing blockchain legislation in the Texas legislature this upcoming session starting in January. We just had the election results, and it's looking good. A lot of our legislative champions won re-election, so we are looking very good at passing a blockchain working group for Texas, as well as other initiatives that are kind of in the same vein as what Wyoming has been doing. So we're kind of going after them as an example, and we're hoping to get a lot of things done in the next year. So that, those two things are what I do. I also lecture at UT Dallas quite a bit now, so very interested if any of you attend UTD or know of it. And then I use resources from both HE3 Labs and Ivan on Tech in case you saw some diagrams in here you might have recognized.